Vice Chair LeRae and members of the committee. My name is Marcell Strbich, and for the second time in 2 months, I appear before this committee requesting equal treatment of voters under the law. Today, I offer opponent testimony of HJR 9 on that basis, that what we're proposing to put in the Constitution is not going to be an equal treatment in the context of verification for a category of voters that our laws created a few years ago, and that is mail-in and absentee ballots, but is applying it in this constitutional amendment against in-person voters. I offer that testimony in that sense. The problem with the resolution is not the goal of requiring voter ID, as it's been discussed today, that's widely understood and unanimously agreed upon, but the unfair and incomplete way that it achieves it. According to the Legislative Services Commission's analysis, passage of HJR 9 would limit the extent to which the current requirements could be changed in the future. That's a key point that I'm going to touch on here. This would constitutionally lock in the existing loophole, or disparity, however you want to refer to it as, preventing future legislators from extending photo ID requirements, should they choose to do that, either with HB 577 or in a future GA, to mail and absentee voting. That outcome would be highly irresponsible of the legislature to close the door on itself for future sessions, especially considering the fact that this is the very same committee that is currently sitting on the enacting statute for this constitutional amendment, HB 577, that would resolve that photo ID loophole and disparate voter treatment under the law. Most Ohioans support universal photo ID, yet many voters will not realize they're being asked to enshrine this clause of unequal treatment, photo ID for in-person voters only, with no requirement for mail-in absentee ballots. Lines 14 to 16 of HJR 9 explicitly specify the requirement for in-person voting. There's a way when laws or constitution is looked at from a principle of statutory or constitutional interpretation that when you express one thing, you exclude others. That type of textual interpretation was taken by Justice Antonin Scalia in Intertribal versus Arizona in 2014, when he explicitly ruled against Arizona's attempt to require documentary proof of citizenship because it was not explicit, it had been excluded on the voter registration form at the time. And this is the same premise that this constitutional amendment will fall under. In effect, lines 14 to 16 creates a negative implication from the affirmative statement, which means a judge who does not see it, as some great legal points were brought up earlier when we brought up the Common Pleas Court in Franklin County, if it doesn't explicitly say it, it's not going to be something you're going to be able to write legislation for. I just want this body, everybody here, to understand the restriction piece that ties to, and I want to frame that in the context of federal legislation, because I think that's informative, because we are making a big move. Moving on. In this context, this approach contradicts the fundamental principle of equality under the law. While the U.S. Supreme Court has rejected redistricting based on race, this legislature appears to be willing to embed an unequal treatment of voters in Ohio's Constitution. It is especially troubling that this committee, while advancing HJR 9, has taken no action on the enacting statute, HB 577, the bill assigned to it that you would actually close the photo ID loophole and restore equal voter treatment under the law. Asking voters to unknowingly approve a two-tiered system, one that has been assessed in the past in a bipartisan way with a higher fraud risk, rather than simply passing the ready statute, suggests misplaced priorities and risks deceiving voters. We have seen this tactic before. In 2022, voters passed a constitutional amendment requiring citizenship to vote, yet the legislature never enacted an enforceable law. Ohio still has no upfront proof of citizenship requirement and is relying on federal support to provide that type of information today, which could go away with the next administration. Asking voters to approve constitutional amendments that could be passed by statute is not leadership, it's diversion. Constitutional changes should correct deficiencies, treat all voters equally, and be accompanied by implementing legislation. The committee has a clear choice: revise HJR 9 to require photo ID for all voters, or continue protecting an unequal system. I strongly urge you to change line 12 to read, all electors shall provide photo identification in order to vote. That is the standard, a very broad standard that would imply all voter categories. Strike lines through 14, which limit the requirement to in-person voting, and that's the part that the LSC itself acknowledges that could form an expression of one thing and an exclusion of the other, limiting your future options after this GA. Strike lines through 39 to 40, which create an escape hatch for weakening that standard later. That's the discussion that occurred around digital ID. And of course, I'll say it one last time because I won't have an opportunity, and I am a constituent now, and this body does work for constituents, passed HB 577 as the companion statute at the same time. With these modest changes, HJR 9 could deliver a fair, equal, and honest photo ID requirement for all Ohio voters. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for the witness? Representative Brent?
Said Brent?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, from the chairwoman to the witness, we meet again, as I like to say, in committee. It's even though we're here to talk about the resolution, it seems like the previous person, you, and the person after you is really fixated on House Bill 577. I wish they would have gave the same type of energy and testimony for that bill instead of right now. But since you are bringing it up, I'm going to talk about it. So there's two current states that currently implement what you are referencing to with the photo IDs for vote by mail. That's Kentucky and Alabama, two states that I don't think Ohio tends to want to be connected to. We tend to, hold on, I let you talk, let me talk. Thank you. So one thing that actually happened with Alabama when they implemented the photo ID requirement that you physically having to turn in that with your vote by mail, their voter turnout for vote by mail has drastically decreased. And those are just based off the numbers. That's not my opinion. Those are based off the numbers from before it to after it. One of the things that came up with the voting rights groups in Alabama is people just not having access to have a physical copy of their photo ID. How can we make sure that voting is accessible to everyone when we are, like we talked about earlier, adding a poll tax where people are going to have to figure out how they can get this done? How is this going to make voting more accessible and keep, allegedly, security without having to deal with, what's it called? Identity theft. How are we going to prevent identity theft and make sure that the voting is accessible?
Okay, through the chair to Rep. Brent, you covered quite a bit there, and I guess I'm being sanctioned from talking about 577, so I'm not sure I'm going to be answering.
You're not getting sanctioned. I can't sanction
no,
you.
I mean, the chair has repeatedly told me we can't talk about an enacting statute when we're actually talking about something that's totally tied and comparable, because one should come before the other. But again, I'm just a witness giving opponent testimony today, and I'd like to share that perspective. In regards to your point about Alabama, there's a lot more context to that I'm not sure I'm aware of, and if you would provide that, I would be able to maybe answer it better. But when you talk about needing to provide an equal standard, that's under the Equal Amendments Clause of the Constitution. We're having a conversation today about changing the Constitution, not talking so much about how the Secretary of State's going to implement it. I mean, if you want that question, the Secretary of State would be the prime person to ask. I believe Kentucky's uploaded that information. We could certainly work with, let's just say, populations that would have more of a challenge in doing that. I do know that this state, besides offering a no-fee, let's refer to it as what Representative Russo said, a no-fee ID, we offer homebound services. That means a Republican and a Democrat go out to a location and they provide not just the potential there for an ID, but a photocopy in and of itself. I couldn't think of a more accommodative state in Ohio that's already servicing people with 28 days of in-person voting, no fault, which was brought up, I believe, by Steve earlier. I mean, we truly go out of our way. Now, all I'm saying is, as a legislature, let's go out of our way to give everybody equal treatment under the law, because we're not going to be back here ever again in all likelihood once this Constitution Amendment is. And if this legislature does that, a wide group of people are going to say, you know what, I'm a proponent of HJR 9, and that's going to be so much more important for us down the road.
Follow-up?
Yes, Chairwoman. So, to the Chairwoman, to the witness, it was stated earlier from a previous witness, and also just factual information, so it wasn't just coming from the witness, that we don't fully fund our Board of Elections totally like we should. So if we start using photo IDs and this is what you're suggesting that gets added on to this resolution, how are we going to deal with the overwhelming amount of administrative work that our overworked and underpaid Board of Elections are going to have to address now that they're going to have to making sure that identity theft is not a thing, because now you're going to have everybody's driver's license and everything loaded up and sent to boards of elections in little pieces of paper. So how are we going to deal with the overwhelming amount of administrative work that's going to go with that?
Through the chair to Rep. Brent, you have a valid point there. What I would say is you're looking at a situation where this body can or can choose not to change the law, how they want to do it in terms of how they want to fund for this and accommodate it. What I think would be important is for an assessment from the Secretary of State's office in terms of what their current resources are. Now, I would suggest that if you guys want to have that conversation overall as a body, then bring people back for HB 577, and we'll talk about that at the time, because your questions pertain to that bill, but I understand the chair doesn't want to have that conversation
Thank you,
today.
Mr. Strbich. Are there any further questions for the witness? Representative Young.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks for coming, Marcell. And I know that you're very schooled in this, and I really appreciate that.
Appreciate you.
I'm getting back to process again. One is, do you feel that protecting the Constitution and voter ID is paramount and very important?
Through the chair to Rep. Young, 100%.
Follow up. I do want to reference a few things. One is and since someone else brought up polls, and we have someone said 94%
I can talk.
of errors. Can you elaborate on that comment? Because I saw your reaction over there. So if you could elaborate on that. And I do have another follow-up after that.
Through the chair to Rep. Young. Yes, so every year the Social Security Administration tracks, and by law, Help America Act is a federal law, it tracks the compliance by the states with that law. And one of those compliance measures is by a group called HAF, and HAF pulls all of the states' 50 different submissions for Social Security numbers. Now in Ohio, there's only several states who originally brought in, grandfathered, that you have to provide your full Social Security number when you send it in to a Board of Elections when it comes to something like that on the driver's license side and the Social Security. In Ohio, it's the last four. Well, that report came back, the annual 2026 report came back in Ohio from the Social Security Administration. And Ohio is the #1 offender thus far in terms of mismatched last four Social Security numbers. And so there were 39,000 that they did a poll on, and 37,000 of them came back with a mismatch. Now, you might be asking the bigger question, which is what I ask when I see a data point, right, as a former intel officer. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because an entire category of voters is going to be casting a no-fault ballot using the last four of their Social Security number. And I say, okay, that's not necessarily end-all, be-all, but here becomes the problem, which is what the chair was alluding to when she brought it up, on how are we going to match that information at the Board of Elections if it's invalid and it's a mismatch. And the answer I've been giving for the last 3 years as I've come before this board, is that the process has to be changed so that qualified eligibility is up front. And the Social Security numbers and the driver's license numbers must be something that the Board of Elections can qualify alongside the BMV, which Rep. Brent brought up earlier, is a private franchise organization. If we don't build system interoperability between information systems, okay, we will not be able to catch mismatched and invalid Social Security numbers. And what that will lead to, based on the current election officials manual, is people will be able to cast a no-fault ballot knowing that they have a mismatched Social Security number. So that's hopefully an answer to your question, sir.
Yes, and I really appreciate that. Could I have a follow-up, please? Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. So we've defined that we have zero fraud, ACLU's comments. We've defined that there's an issue with Social Security numbers mismatch. And we've also discussed confidence in voting, how many people come out to vote, so on and so forth. My question is that, my question is this, but I want to make a comment. we know that voters in Ohio across all segments, and this is about 80% for a constitutional amendment for voter ID. When you add another provision of like 577, I believe, is that the legislation we're reading?
The current.
Yeah, yes. It falls down significantly. And tagging off of Ranking Member Brent's many questions, and I really appreciate those, support drops. And then when you say that we're going to store the data, and even in the most perfect world, and I will tag off comments that Representative Russo has brought up in another committee on encryption and security, it falls to almost 5% that say we don't trust anyone to keep our data. So isn't it important to focus on something that we know that the voters want in Ohio across all segments of the population?
Through the chair to Rep. Young, I agree with you in principle on that. You're talking about a few different things kind of conjoined together about data control, management, protections, all that stuff. You're going to find 90-some% of people also agree on that. I just think one of the differences in the testimony I'm giving to you all today is you're about to cross a Rubicon, right? Whether you're for this or you're not for this. And ultimately, when you're deciding to do that, right, equal application of the law will be how this legislature will be determined on it. We passed a voter ID bill in 2022, and we took into account people who are in population subsets that would be more challenging. Technology has changed, our data storage has changed, our interoperability and our information systems have improved. The legislation and the constitutional amendment have to apply equality. And that is the most important thing here. I'm not talking today about security, even though that's my background. I'm talking about equality. If you close the door on this now by not changing this resolution, which it's a very simple change, it's very simple, then it will effectively limit in a number of ways, as I explained from a constitutional interpretation and judging, that this could be a real challenge. We could end up fighting it out. And as it was brought up earlier, anybody can bring a challenge. I could bring a challenge. They could bring a challenge. And why would we want that in the court systems when we can just apply equal and fair treatment to all categories? We should not be creating voter categories that can do it this way or do it that way. What we should be doing is we should be adjusting the process, the resources, the people in organizing ourselves around the equal treatment. And I fear that we are getting ourselves down a rabbit hole when we're talking about what about this group and what about that group and what about this process or that process. We are talking about a constitutional resolution today. It has to be simple. It doesn't need ORC code information in there about another document. You already have that authority. Legislature already has the authority to create a law and redefine what's a photo ID. Why add this kind of extraneous language? I'm not a constitutional expert, but I'm informed enough to know that we make this thing simple. I think it's a win-win for everybody. Thank you for your question.
I have a question, Mr. Strbich. There are a lot of people that argue mail-in absentee ballot is the most secure. Because not only are you getting either last for the Social Security and driver's license number, but that random signature has to match up with a signature file that's on file at the Board of Elections and is reviewed by a bipartisan team. Why do you think a photo ID is more secure than somebody's handwriting signature when you're not going to see them next to the photo?
Yeah, through the chair, thank you for your question. The reality is, I or anybody in this day and age of high privacy, personally identifiable theft can go out and acquire or purchase anybody's driver's license, anybody's social security number, or they can just make up 1, 2, 3, 4. And as we can tell from the Social Security Administration, they're having a difficult time making Ohio compatible with the law. So
They can't by their signature.
Their signature can also be re-registered, and we have seen evidence in different counties where people who did not register in Ohio had their re-registration and re-baselining of the signature. And as I'm sure you're aware, as a Board of Election official, appointed official, if a baseline signature provided at somebody's application matches the application form for an absentee ballot, there is no further inquiry required, no further investigation required in Ohio law for Board of Election officials. In other words, this was discussed two bills ago with Rep. Wiggum and Voter Verification Act. The Board of Elections can be literally validating 2 false signatures and then allowing that absentee ballot form to go forward. So if I was an unscrupulous third-party person, and again, I see the world through threat assessment because of my military training and background, I would be going at that exploitative capability. So the way we stop that is we equip the Board of Elections with qualified information like driver's license, like social security numbers. So when that piece of paper comes in, front and back copy, that professional who's administering that and reviewing it can actually check that for 1 minute and make sure that the information is actually correct, that it's not just a form filled out in a field, which is unfortunately the current standard that I would like to see corrected at the Board of Elections.
Well, just one follow-up. You seem to fall back on a security concern when it benefits your argument, but not when it doesn't. And you're saying that these signatures can be falsified, but then so can a driver's license and a social security. What suggestions do you have to make elections totally secure that would soothe your anxiety over them?
Well, Chairman, I wouldn't call it anxiety. I would call it an equal standard. And that's why I came here today to apply that. I think if you were to equip the Board of Elections with the information like citizenship, driver's license, and again, I ran on this, but again, I was only 30%. So driver's license and social security number, then if they had that information, they should be validating that up front, right? Instead, they create a voter ID number before they even confirm the information is correct. So you're still gonna, even if you apply this equal treatment under the law for absentee ballots, you're still gonna have to equip the Board of Elections to do what they have to do.
Any other questions for the witness? No? Representative Russo.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you to the witness for being here. I think you bring up some very interesting points of opposition to this constitutional amendment. I guess my question for you, and you can speculate or not, what do you think is the motivation of this particular constitutional resolution without the pieces that you and a few others have recommended? What do you think is the motivation here?
Yeah, Chair Ray to Rep. Russo, I appreciate the question. I think we are in an unfortunate place in our life, in our society, where we have these two sides that are trying to one-up each other when it comes to elections. One side is putting forward legislation or rules that they're thinking are advantaging in the moment. The other side is posturing to do the same thing when they get into a position. And we just kind of go round and round in circles with these arguments. Part of that calculus, I think, has to do with this idea that one day, will a group of legislators, perhaps, let's say the other party, come in, and will they go back to a student ID? Will they go back to utility bill statements, which is what the law was before we had a voter ID passed? And so the idea of enshrining it in the Constitution, I agree with in principle, if it's not to create a loose standard, but it's also equally applied. So in all honesty, the assessment that I have is it comes down to wanting to preempt something in the future that the other side would change back if they were in those shoes. I think that's the most honest assessment I can give you.
A quick follow-up. But the timing of it now, the rush to do it in this way, do you think it's motivated by the upcoming election?
Well, Representative Russo, every election motivates election and legislatures, I should say, from looking at laws and saying what they'd want to change. I haven't been privy to any of these conversations. As you can see, I'm a proponent of voter ID. I just want it to be equal across the board, but I have to give opponent testimony today, which just baffles my mind, right? In a week, I've had to do what you and everybody else has had to do. I just don't think we need to do it in the way that it's being done, but I understand that this is also a political world. And if it was just based about policy or administration, I think most people would appreciate it to be based on that, because we all just want people to have their votes and rights secured and free, fair, and honest. Thank you for your question.
Just one more quick. So if I'm understanding your opposition, and I understand your theory about the unequal treatment across the voting methods, but as the amendment currently stands, you would prefer, because you brought up another piece of legislation, you would prefer, at this point, through changes to legislation, Ohio Revised Code, as opposed to this approach with the constitutional amendment. Would that be correct for me to say that?
Yeah, through the chair to Rep. Russo, I prefer that they go through simultaneously, that this amendment be revised. Thank you for the question. That it be revised to account for striking lines 14 to 16, because I don't think we need to create an exclusionary category, as I said. And I prefer that, unlike the constitutional amendment for citizens vote that went through in 2022, that we actually pass this as well, because it gives us time to enact it within the 90 days, at least until you all are outside of summer session. And then we don't have to do this again. We don't have to come back and present other legislation and take more of your all's time the next session. I think this is the one way we do it, equally, fairly, and we have the enacting statute.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you very much for coming in today.